Okay, let's go. Solving with square roots. Okay. This should not be too super difficult, but there is something you are going to forget because your calculator doesn't do it for you, and you have to remember it. Okay? When you take the square root of a number, what you're really saying is, what number squared gives me this answer? So when I say the square root of 25, what you're trying to find is what number squared would give you 25? 5, right? Is there anything else that you could square to get 25? Negative 5, right? Because negative 5 times negative 5 would give you a positive 25. So when you do a square root of 64 or 25 or any of those perfect squares, when you do a square root of a number, it really has two square roots, a positive one and a negative one. When you type it into your calculator only gives you the positive one. Okay? So when you're solving, so that's one thing to keep in mind. That's one thing to remember. The other thing to remember goes back to equation solving. Remember, equation solving is all about undoing everything. It's all about doing everything in reverse. So if you're given this equation, x squared equals 16, and you're trying to get x by itself, you want to undo the square. What is the opposite of squaring? Square rooting, right? So to get rid of that square, I would take a square root and a square root. And what's the square root of 16? 4. Or, yep. You've got to have both. Every one of these equations will have two answers. Well, there's one exception to that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But for the most part, every time you solve an equation that has an x squared in it, you're going to have two answers. And we're going to be talking about a lot of different ways to solve quadratics in this chapter. Quadratics, by the way, are any equation that have an x squared in them. Okay? Almost every time you're going to end up with two solutions. Okay? So just keep that in mind. Another way to write this, you may have seen this notation before. If your answer is just the positive and negative version of a number, you could say x equals plus or minus 4, like that. That's kind of saying both answers in one. Okay? Okay. Number 2. The other thing I want to remind you about before we jump into number 2 is when we do equation solving. I'm not sure if I taught it to you this way this year or not. Anyway, I'll teach it to you now. What's this? What's that used for? That's order of operations, right? That's like, what order do you do math in? When I give you an expression, what order do you do the things in? Well, solving an equation is like undoing things. So you're doing order of operations in reverse. To solve an equation, you are doing SADMAP. Yep. This is the order that you undo things. First you undo subtraction and addition, then you undo division and multiplication, then you undo exponents, then you undo parentheses. So when you get a problem like this, like number 2, okay, your first instinct is, oh, there's an x squared, I need to do a square root. But what do you need to get rid of first? Yeah, how are you going to do it? Yeah. Plus 5. That's going to give you x squared equals 144. And now, square root. What's square root of 144? Or, yep, don't forget the or. X equals 12 or x equals negative 12, because both of those would work. Could also say x equals plus or minus 12. All right, number 3. What do you want to do with number 3 first? Okay, subtract the 1. So 4x squared equals 16. Now what do you want to do? Divide by 4. Good. People forget that a lot. You don't want to take a square root until you're down to just something squared. Okay, here you have 4x squared, but we have to get rid of the 4 before we can take a square root. So get rid of the 4, you would have x squared equals 4. And now I can take my square root, right? So take a square root, take a square root. X equals plus or minus 2. Don't forget the plus or minus. Okay? If you forget the plus or minus, half of your answer is missing. Okay? So you will lose half of your points. Now number 4 is a little different. And honestly, I wish that, I teach this lesson in the same order that your textbook does them, but I wish this lesson did not follow directly from the lesson we just did on doing FOIL. Because you see this and your first instinct is to FOIL. But remember, equation solving is not about doing things, it's about undoing things. So we're trying to undo a square. Can I add the 3 right now? No, because it's inside the parentheses. Okay? Not until I can get it out of the parentheses can I get rid of that 3. And I can't get rid of the parentheses until I get rid of the square. So let's get rid of the square. I'm going to take a square root. You're going to want to make sure you write down all the steps for this one, even if you've skipped out on me on the last few, because this one you're going to miss if you don't. This square root and this square cancel each other out. So you're left with x minus 3. What's the square root of 64? 8. Or negative 8, yep. So now I have 2 different equations. Okay? In all the other ones, when I have taken the square root, I've only been left with an x. So I was done with my problem. See how here I took a square root and I was left with x? Up here, I took a square root and I was left with just x. So that was my answer. Here, when I took the square root, I still had an x minus 3 here. So now I have 2 different equations to solve. And it's not going to work out where I can just solve one of them and say, okay, the answer is plus or minus this. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. If I was going to solve this one, I would add 3 to each side. What's 8 plus 3? 11. Okay, so x equals 11. Or, here if I add 3 to each side, what's negative 8 plus 3? Negative 5. So you still end up with 2 answers, but they're 2 totally different answers. Okay? So it's not always just going to be plus or minus a certain number. Okay? When you end up with things like this, where you still have equation solving to do after you take the square root, you're going to end up with 2 different answers. Okay? So let's look at number 5. What do you want to do first in that one? Garrett? Yeah, we have to get rid of that 6 that's outside of the parentheses. Okay? So kind of your process is get rid of everything that's outside of the parentheses, take a square root to get rid of the parentheses, and then do the stuff that's inside. So here I would divide by 6. Here I would divide by 6. And so I'm left with x plus 1 squared equals 1. Shift this down a little bit. Now what do you want to do? Square root. So here you're left with just, I'm going to move this over here. Here you're left with x plus 1. What's the square root of 1? 1 and negative 1, yeah? So you would say x plus 1 is 1, or x plus 1 is negative 1. Okay? Subtract 1, x equals 0. Subtract 1, what does x equal over here? Negative 2, good. Okay, so x equals 0 or x equals negative 2 are your 2 answers. I want to throw one at you that works out a little bit differently, so I'm going to kind of make this up on the fly. Have you write it down. Okay. Write down that example someplace. Down here. It's 3 times x plus 4 squared minus 2 equals negative 77. Remember that when you're faced with a problem like this one, you want to get the things out from outside of the parentheses first. We want to get rid of everything that's outside of the parentheses. So what do you want to do first? Okay, let's get rid of that negative 2. How am I going to do it? Add positive 2. So 3 times x plus 4 squared equals negative 75. Now what? Divide by 3. So I'm left with x plus 4 squared equals negative 25. Now what? Stephen? Say it. Okay. Good, good. At this point, I would take a square root, right? Somebody type into a calculator, square root of negative 25. Yeah, non-real answer. This doesn't work, at least not yet. I'm going to teach you about imaginary numbers later. But right now, for our purposes, this cannot happen. That's not okay. This means no solution. And that's what I meant earlier when I said there are exceptions to the having two solutions. If you don't have two solutions, you could have no solutions. Okay? So anytime you're taking a square root of a negative number, it's going to be no solution. However, you can't just look at the original problem and say, oh, because it equals a negative over here, it's automatically not going to work. Because sometimes when you're doing these other steps, sometimes when you're getting rid of like this 3 or this 2 or whatever the stuff outside the parentheses is, when you get rid of that, sometimes you're going to flip from negative to positive or positive to negative. So you can't tell until you get to the point where you're actually taking the square root. When you go to take the square root, if you're left with a negative number over there, that's when it's going to be no solution. Okay, think you can handle a few of these today? Oh, you look ready and rearing to go.